In April of last year, then Commissioner Darrell D'Souza appointed an independent review board and charged them with reviewing the facts of the case. And that meant everything from Detective Souters' death, our response, our crime scene management, and more.
This IRB report is really new evidence in this case, and that it should be treated as new evidence, and that is that these agencies, the medical examiner and the Baltimore Police Department, should then use it to reinvestigate to see whether these are in fact meritorious and whether it warrants a change in their findings or their classifications. We are critical of the former commissioner in the fact that he did not update the narrative and continue to say that there was a long, physical struggle. There was a killer loose, and the killer looks like, and he described a sort of a general description of that.
But when people are emotionally involved in an issue, whether they're community members or police officers or police leaders, it's very difficult to look at facts and accept them. And I fully expect some of that to continue.
So let's start from the top. Do you believe Sean Souter killed himself?
I believe that we are no closer today from conclusively knowing what happened than we were several months ago. The Independent Review Board certainly put forward an effort, but at the end of it all, they rehashed existing evidence. They looked at existing evidence from a different perspective. They made a lot of assumptions that I didn't expect about Sean Souter's state of mind, which is fine if you're going to follow up those assumptions with interviews with the people who matter most to him in his life. For example, his wife, Nicole Souter, his sergeant, and his squad. And it really shocked me that interviews with those folks never happened. So if you're going to put forward that narrative that Sean Souter had a suicidal state of mind, I think it only makes sense that those interviews would have taken place, and they simply did not.
I pushed him on that yesterday, in that press conference yesterday, that they did not interview Nicole Souter. I don't know who they've interviewed. They wouldn't release a list of who they've interviewed. Does that matter?
Certainly it matters. I think, again, I know for a fact that they didn't interview his sergeant, and I know for a fact they didn't interview his squad. So as you put forward... Or his wife. So as you put forward information about Sean Souter not answering texts or phone calls from his lawyer, well, that may be true, but what also is true is that he and his wife had a telephone conversation an hour before he died. That's relevant, and to not include that, to me, is surprising. Now, one of the challenges with an independent review board that's a paid consultant is that there's an enormous amount of pressure to come to a conclusion. So it did surprise me that the independent review board came to a conclusion, because it's a conclusion after 9+ months that the Baltimore Police Department hasn't been able to reach, yet the independent review board comes to what really came across as a very strong conclusion in their mind.
You were able to read this report when it posted like the rest of us, right?
Yes.
What was upon concluding your reading, what was your initial reaction?
Well, when I started to read it, I expected some criticisms, well-deserved, of me personally in my leadership role for the Harlem Park community, and I have acknowledged, and I'll acknowledge now, that I could have better handled the community after I'd made a decision to hold the crime scene. And the reason why I had to hold the crime scene was sound. We didn't have an autopsy until 5 days after Sean was killed, and we had to hold the crime scene, and we had to restrict access to Bennett Place. Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I should have done a better job communicating those reasons to the Harlem Park community, and I regret that. But what I didn't expect to see were questions about me, quote unquote, misleading the community. For example, the suspect description that I gave out that was based upon the last human being that saw Sean Souter alive, his partner. So that suspect description, as vague as it was, existed. And I think any police chief, police commissioner in this country would have articulated that suspect description. And then there's questions about me not communicating with the public about Sean Souter's grand jury testimony.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. In this report, they say on November 16th, the day after Sean was murdered, is the day that you learned from the feds that he was indeed supposed to testify the following day in a grand jury.
That's correct. But what also is correct is that the special agent in charge of the FBI was on the crime scene with me the night that Sean Souter was shot, and he was with me in Harlem Park, he was with me on the command bus, and he never said one word to me about Sean Souter, not one word. So the next day I get on a conference call with the special agent in charge of the FBI and the acting U.S. attorney, and they told me that Souter's name had come up during interviews they were having pursuant to the broken boundaries investigation, the corruption investigation. And they told me emphatically that Sean Souter was not a target of the investigation. They told me that he was scheduled to testify in front of a grand jury the day after he was killed. And within days, in fact, it was the day before Thanksgiving, I shared that information with the community at a press conference. Within days after that, I shared with the community at another press conference on December the 1st that I thought suicide was a possibility. So the assertions within the Independent Review Board that I misled the public, those are completely false. I resent them. They're inaccurate, and it's simply not true.
Why not tell the public on, say, the 16th or the 17th of Sean Souter's pending grand jury testimony?
Well, the 15th is when Sean Souter was shot. He didn't die until 4 days later. I was given information from the feds that his name came up during the Broken Boundaries investigation. I would argue that my release of that information to the community was something that I voluntarily did just a couple days later, after the funeral. Certainly, is it important information? Yes, it is. But does it necessarily change the circumstances associated with the afternoon of November 15th? Maybe, maybe not. But if you just read the report and you don't know any better, the report suggests that I held on to that information longer than I should have. I dispute that. Within days, I shared it with the community. The report seems to suggest that I didn't recognize the possibility of suicide. I certainly did. I did it publicly. The first time I did it was December 1st, a mere 12 days or so after Sean Souter was pronounced dead. So I did share that information.
Why you held on to it until after the funeral? Was that on purpose?
Well, I had a great amount of, or I still do have a great amount of respect for any family member for a line of duty death. And I did not want to speak in a manner that was without conclusions about things that would upset the family. So the decision I made when the funeral was done is that I was going to share with the community the fact that Sean Souter was scheduled to testify as a witness with limited immunity, and then Sean Souter's death was possibly a suicide. So I shared all those things with the community. I guess the Independent Review Board takes issue with the timeliness of me sharing those things with the community. The IRB report also takes issue with me sharing too much information. So you can't have it both ways. Either I shared too much information or I didn't share enough information. They flip-flop back and forth. But I would argue that the information I shared was timely, and I did it in a way that was respectful to the Souter family and to the Baltimore Police Department.
They also accuse you of knowing that the FBI was not going to take this case, but you had the press conference anyway. At least the field office here said no, and you gave them an hour, like, well, I'm going to plea up above your heads.
Yeah, well, that's not exactly accurate. I had conversations with the special agent in charge of the Baltimore field office, and I knew that he did not want to take the case. But I also know, like any organization, there's a hierarchy, and I knew that the appropriate person for me to make that request to was the director of the FBI. So I don't think I went around him. I don't think I went over his head. I think I made that request to the appropriate person, the director of the FBI, to take over this investigation because I was growing increasingly concerned about information that was being spoon-fed to me. And I first found out about the superseding indictment where Sean Souter's name, not name, but Sean Souter is referenced in a superseding indictment regarding a 2010 police pursuit and a planting of drugs inside of a car by Sergeant Jenkins. I never knew that before at all. I found out the same time the media found out, and that upset me. I was convinced that not enough information was being shared with me. I thought the right thing to do would be to request the FBI to take the entire investigation for issues of legitimacy and transparency. So you talk about transparency. I don't know any more of a transparent effort to make than to ask another agency, particularly a federal government agency, to take the entire case. Because I thought then, and I still believe now, that they possess information about the overall circumstances of GTTF and the Broken Boundaries investigation that the Baltimore Police Department still doesn't know about.
There were some mistakes in this report. Yeah, I don't know if you're, so there's the Herschel mistake about the GTTF and the and Souters' connection is a large part of their thesis of why he committed suicide. His grand jury testimony, his involvement or may not have been involvement in the GTTF. But then they cite a cooperation letter from Herschel because he pled guilty and didn't go to trial, when in fact he pleaded not guilty and then went to trial for 3 weeks. Does that kind of mistake, when you saw that, what was your reaction?
That kind of mistake, Brian, is unacceptable. This is a $150,000 report that makes a very strong conclusion that suicide was the manner of death. So everything in that report, I would expect, the community would expect, is completely accurate. So their assertion about Detective Herschel and his court case and his cooperation with the government and pleading not guilty was entirely false. On a personal level, they put inside the report that the Afro-American newspaper said that I indicated that Detective Souter was engaged in a conversation with the suspect before the shooting occurred. I never said that. Never said it. If I were to have said something of that gravity, it would have been picked up on by you and everyone else in the region. And T.J. Smith pointed that out to the board in one of his interviews with them, that Kevin Davis never said that. So they still put it in there, and I think they put it in there because it fits a narrative. And every good story has to have a protagonist and an antagonist, and when they couldn't come up with new evidence and when they just looked at existing evidence from a different perspective, I think a decision was made to identify a person, a leader, a police commissioner, and highlight, exaggerate, embellish missteps that they thought I made to take away from the main purpose of the report is to determine how Sean Souter died. I think there's a lot of noise inside that report, 200 and some odd pages. I think the question Baltimoreans have is, how did Sean Souter die? Not, did Kevin Davis wait 2 days or 5 days to talk about the grand jury testimony? Did Kevin Davis wait a week or 12 days to talk about suicide being a possibility? I think those are all distractions. I think the investigation has a lot of holes in it. I think whenever a jurisdiction engages in a contractual relationship with a consultant, the consultant feels an obligation, feels some amount of pressure to come up with a conclusion. And I firmly believe that the conclusion best reached by this independent review board should have been, we don't know any more now than we did when we started this. We don't know any more now than we did when we started this. But they didn't want to go forward with that conclusion. They came up with one that simply is not supported strongly enough by the evidence.
Some reports have made a lot about, there does seem to be a lot of circumstantial evidence in this report. Some reports have made a lot of the idea that he Googled Vaughn Green Funeral Home. As the commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, who obviously has a homicide department, do you know of any reason why a homicide detective would Google Vaughn Green Funeral Home in Baltimore?
So the independent review board makes an assumption, or asks its readers to go along with it, that a detective Googling a funeral home may be indicative of his mindset to be suicidal. That's a huge assumption. But in fact, Baltimore police detectives routinely Google funeral homes to see when their victims are being buried, when their victims are having their viewings. Sometimes Baltimore homicide detectives want to have a presence at those events, so they Google the address so they can share it with other components within the organization. So that's a huge, huge assumption. And you wouldn't think that you would find that type of thing inside of a report that should be far more objective than that.
Is it also not true that there's a form within the police department where you have to write down
There is. So any homicide detective in Baltimore who wants to request a detective, for example, from the intelligence unit to accompany him to a viewing or to a funeral, there's a form associated with that. And the name of the funeral home for the victim is on the form, and the address for the funeral home is also on the form. And while Vaughn Green Funeral Home serves half the city, I doubt many people can rattle off the exact address. So hence, a detective, probably what Sean Souter did, and I'm guessing here, but the report's guessing too. He probably just Googled it for the address. The fact that Sean Souter made a recent inquiry about his death benefits was made at the suggestion of an in-service training class that encouraged police officers to make sure that their beneficiary for their line of duty deaths is the person who they want it to be. So again, just another assumption after assumption after assumption, and it just requires the readers to engage in these mental and moral gymnastics to go along for the ride in the Independent Review Board report to reach a conclusion of homicide. Now, I think it would have been acceptable or more acceptable, more believable if the report concluded that it may be more likely than not, or there may be a preponderance of the evidence, but they conclusively determined, without a shadow of a doubt, that Sean Souter killed himself. And what I said earlier today is, if a police commissioner is going to say that, he or she better be right. And for a police department under a consent decree, after the in-custody death of Freddie Gray, after the riots, after the GTTF, within 64 days that I had after Sean Souter was killed as a police commissioner, I never felt comfortable enough with the suicide angle to stand in front of this city and say Sean Souter committed suicide. I think if I were to have said such a thing, we would suffer even a more devastating blow to our credibility, to our authenticity. There is a feeling that this thing needs to be wrapped up. It needs to have a bow on it, and it needs to be put on a shelf so the city and the police department can, quote unquote, move on.
So you're saying this is a politically expedient conclusion?
Well, hiring a consultant, giving a consultant a finite financial contract, sure, there's a lot of pressure to come up with a conclusion. And I think it takes a humble person to look at all the facts, look at all the circumstances, look at all the evidence, and say, you know what? We have nothing more now than we did back then, in spite of some of the best people in the business looking at this case. And they had some great people on it. And I only take issue with former or retired Baltimore police detectives being on the Independent Review Board because that negates the independence of the review board. It's a conflict of interest. So those two detectives from BPD who are on the review board, great guys, great reputations, nothing personal, but an Independent Review Board has to have a greater degree of independence than that.
So is that where you're at with this now? There's not enough to say that he was killed, there's not enough to say that he committed suicide?
Well, the medical examiner ruled this a homicide, and only the medical examiner can change that ruling. So none of the evidence that I saw presented by the Independent Review Board made me think differently about this case. It was existing evidence looked at from a different perspective, and I don't think we're at a place where we can conclusively say that Sean Souter took his own life. I just don't think we're there.
The idea of this board ringing that bell, of saying suicide, that they concluded suicide, and what that may mean for the Souter family, based on what you're saying is a circumstantial report. What is your view of that?
Well, the medical examiner's office ruled this a homicide. So that means that Sean Souter is a homicide victim.
Right.
So now we just added another victim to the list, Nicole Souter and her 5 children.
Do you remember well, obviously you remember, when they came to interview you, the IRB, how long did it take? How long did you interview with them?
I went and met with the chair and the co-chair for probably an hour and a half or 2 hours or so.
Did you feel like they listened to you?
None of our conversation is included in the Independent Review Board report. I did that to avoid criticisms that I refused to meet with them. I didn't anticipate that they were going to reflect on everything I had to say to them. It's my strong opinion, very respectfully to the people involved in the IRB board, that they engaged in inductive reasoning. They started off with a conclusion, and then they filled in the blanks. And I don't know of any other way to think of it, especially when you look at the fact that they ignored such important people to interview. Nicole Souter, Sean Souter's sergeant, Sean Souter's squad. Those interviews didn't take place. And in a deductive investigation, they do. But an inductive view of all of this starts with a conclusion. The chair of the Independent Review Board shared with me that the police commissioner who succeeded me told the board that he thought Sean Souter accidentally shot and killed himself.
And your thoughts on that,
It's impossible
based on,
based on the evidence.
I mean, 3 shots.
3 shots. I've been on many scenes where police officers have accidentally discharged their firearm, and each and every time in my 26 years, 1 shot and 1 shot only is fired, not 3.
Yeah.
But I offer that as an example of their proclivity, their inductive reasoning, starting with the conclusion, being under the gun with a finite financial contract, being under all the pressure from the politicos and the community and the media. They, I believe, felt compelled to come up with a conclusion, and I think the facts don't support the conclusion. I was really looking forward, Brian, to reading this report because I've been gone for over 8 months now. And my best guess was that they were going to offer some new evidence to, especially if they were going to say Sean killed himself. But there was no new evidence in there. So I think that's what people have to really stop and think at. And Brian, the question that you asked Chip Stewart yesterday, the chair of the Independent Review Board, you asked him if they were 100% certain that Sean Souter committed suicide. And there was a dramatic pause in the room, a dramatic pause.
So then I go back to my original question. With 100% certainty, can you say that Sean Souter committed suicide?
And then he said something to the effect of they have greater confidence now than they did before.
We can say that we've increased the confidence in the finding of the report, and that's where we're going to leave it.
Well, that dramatic pause should tell Baltimore that we can't definitively conclude suicide. And if we can't definitively conclude suicide, we don't need to victimize Nicole Souter and her family. We don't need to demonize and disparage Sean Souter and his good name.